Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about something pretty interesting. I don't know if you guys have ever encountered anybody that's Ukrainian or Russian, but when you come up to somebody who's Ukrainian and you say, hey, are you Russian? They'll right away answer, no, I'm Ukrainian. Well, today we're going to be talking about the difference between Russians and Ukrainians and why these two groups consider themselves different. Stick around to listen to more. Hey guys, I'm Daniel from Doldier Media, and today I'm going to talk about the difference between Russian people and Ukrainian people. Growing up in a community where we had a lot of Russians and Ukrainians, people did get a little bit upset if you thought they were the other nationality. For the people in the West, Russians and Ukrainians, they look alike, they sound alike, so people think they're the same people. But unfortunately, I have some bad news for you, they're not. Well, technically they are, but they're not. Before we talk about any differences between the Russian and Ukrainian people, let's talk about some of the similarities. The alphabet, for the most part, is very similar. One of the few differences between Russian and Ukrainian is that in Russian, the hard G is pronounced as a G, and in Ukrainian it's pronounced as an H. So in the words like God or Bog, in Ukrainian it would be Bog. And so you see that a lot. Outside of that, there's very few differences, but the language is written the same way. Beyond that, we see that both Ukrainians and Russians have the same types of layouts in their cities and in their countries. So we see that center of power, or the bigger cities like St. Petersburg, Moscow, or Kiev and Odessa, are very prosperous. They look a lot better. There's everything there. But outside of those cities, it kind of becomes a little bit more villagey. There's smaller little towns and everything gets a little bit more run down. Some of the roads don't even work. There's potholes everywhere. And outside of major cities in both Ukraine and Russia, life isn't all that great. Another similarity between Russia and Ukraine is the food. There's almost no way of telling apart Ukrainian food versus Russian food. There are some differences, like Ukrainians are known for making borscht and Russians are known for making shchi. Now, there is an interesting video I'm going to link down below. I talked in my previous video about Russian food being more for sustenance and not necessarily for taste or pleasure. And just like Russia, Ukraine is not really known for its food. Russian and Ukrainian food isn't something that you really want to take people out on a date to. If you have a really good date and you want to go to a fancy place, the first place you're not going to go to is a Russian restaurant. The fifth place is not going to be right. You're probably not going to go to a Russian restaurant at all on a date. Now, what's interesting is in the 1800s, because of the French influence on the society in Russia and Ukraine, they actually opened up really fancy restaurants in Russia at that time. One of the most famous Russian and Ukrainian salads, which is called oliviye, was actually created at that time. And it was created by a Belgian guy named Olivier, or at least that's his last name. And there's an interesting video, the link is down in the description, of a guy who actually tries to imitate this original recipe of how Olivier originally was. So if you are interested in how it was originally made, after this video, hit the link down below. It's a pretty cool watch. Another similarity we see between Ukrainians and Russians is their cultural outfits. I'm a little biased, but I think the cultural outfits of the Ukrainians and Russians look really cool. Also, their dances are pretty fascinating. But about the outfits, their outfits were so unique to the rest of the world that when they were making Star Wars Episode 1, in order to make the royal dresses of the Queen, they actually were inspired by Russian cultural outfits. So if you watch the movie, you'll actually see the headwear that people even wore to royal parties at that time. Another cool feature of cultural attire of the Russians and Ukrainians is that back in the days, you can actually identify what region somebody's from by the colors they're wearing. Each style of knitting and actual color would tell you where you're from in the region, in the Slavic lands. Aside from that, another similarity that Russians and Ukrainians have is going to be in their politics. Now, Russians and Ukrainians both understand that politicians are usually corrupt, and they both have a corrupt sense of government. Nobody trusts government, nobody trusts what happens with the politicians, and both in Ukraine and Russia, people really don't think they have a say in what goes on in their country. They kind of know that the politicians are just going to try to steal from them. I have a funny story. I went to Ukraine a few years ago, and I was talking to one of my relatives, and one of my relatives was telling me that the road is pretty bad, and I asked them, hey, why don't they repair it? I mean, it had potholes that were about 2 feet, 3 feet wide. And I asked him, why don't they repair the road? And he said, oh, on paper, it was repaired last year. The politician apparently took all the money, pocketed it, but on paper put that he repaired the road and nobody did anything about it. You see the same kind of stuff happening in Russia also. An example of this would be the Sochi Olympics. It reportedly cost $50 billion, and I think that's a little suspicious in my opinion. In terms of pop culture, they both have the same type of humor. They both have the same type of comedians, musicians, athletes. They're both known for almost the same exact stuff. The people are identical. In terms of economics of Russia and Ukraine, both countries have a hyperinflated currency. It's undervalued. People in both countries on average don't make that much money. When people leave those countries, they have similar mindsets in terms of economics. They want to save. So with all my research, I came to a lot of things that were similar with Russian people and Ukrainian people. It was almost difficult to find differences between the two people. The only differences I could find were due to their history and political oppression. Now I'm going to give a history of what happened between the Ukrainian and the Russian people. Where did they split up? And why Ukrainian people don't like to be called Russian people. But before you watch this part, subscribe to my channel, hit that like button. Thank you guys for watching so far. I am going to give a history. A lot of people don't like history. If you do want to know the history, stick around till the end and it's going to be pretty fascinating. The history is kind of what separates the people, at least from what I've studied. The biggest difference between the two people happened somewhere in their history. So Ukraine is right next to Russia, next to the Black Sea. Genetically speaking, Ukrainians and Russians are both part of the R18 haplogroup. Now, a haplogroup is how we determine genetically where somebody comes from. It's a pretty fascinating process. I'm not going to get into the details, but how we determine a haplogroup is over years of people having kids and having kids and having kids. Somewhere along the line, there's going to be a mutation on their DNA, and that mutation is not going to change their DNA, but it's still going to be there. And how we could tell who a certain group of people is by that mutation. And so, like, let's say my ancestors from 2,000 years ago had one mutation on this DNA on one chromosome, and everybody that was a descendant of that ancestor also had that same mutation. And so according to their research, they assign that a name and they call it a haplogroup. A haplogroup is how we determine where somebody's from. So genetically speaking, Russian and Ukrainian people are the exact same haplogroup. You can't really tell through DNA if somebody's from Russia or if somebody's from Ukraine. So then why are these two groups so vehemently opposed to being identified as one another, even though genetically they're the same? So let's look at their history. Some historians believe that the Thracians and other groups of people, maybe some Germanic tribes, were the original people that were the Slavs. Regardless of who the original people were, after a certain period of time, the Southern Slavs, or the Yugoslavs as they're known, became the Bulgarian Empire around the year 800. The Bulgarian Empire became the South Slavic whole region, and they're the ones who dominated the language of the Slavic people. They're the ones that actually first wrote the Slavic language. We had two, we don't know if they're Byzantine, Greek, or Bulgarian, but their names were Cyril and Methodius. And these two monks wrote the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, the Cyrillic alphabet is named after Cyril, the actual monk himself. He's the one that got the Greek alphabet. And if you look on the screen right now, you'll see that Greek and Russian look very similar to one another. And so when he standardized the Russian language, that Bulgarian region, everybody began to speak like that language, and the traditions began to easily be passed on with the written language now. That language that Cyril and Methodius wrote was known as Old Slavonic Language. Obviously, at that time, it wasn't old, it was New Slavonic Language. At the same time that Bulgaria was taking over South Slav or Yugoslavia, the Khazar or the Khazar Empire was ruling most of what we know today as Russia and Ukraine. Now, the Khazars were Turkic-speaking people, and they eventually got conquered and taken out by the Slavic people. Now, around that same time, we have Rurik, like I spoke about in my previous video. Rurik was actually a Viking prince or a king almost, and he was asked to be the leader of Russia. Now, Russia at that time wasn't known as Russia, the same Russia that we know about today. At that time, the people of the Rus people lived in Kiev, and they were called the Kievsky Rus people. Rurik, the Viking prince who ruled over these people, had sons, and his sons divided the kingdom and each took over lands. So one of his sons became the king that's in Kievsky Rus, or in Kiev, modern day Ukraine. Another son became the king of this area called Novgorod. Now, Novgorod is considered Russia. And at that time, that was Russia. But the people of Novgorod didn't consider themselves to be Rus. The people of Rus strictly lived in Ukraine. So it gets a little bit confusing because Ukrainians were actually originally Rus. They were Russian before the Russians were Russian. Now, Novgorod in Russian is new city, or Novgorod. Now, the people of Novgorod became the rulers of Russia. Their capital eventually moved to Moscow, while in Ukraine and that principality, their capital moved to this region called Halicia or Halchina. Now, this area was in western Ukraine today, and Halchina around the year 1200 already had a king, and this was a Ukrainian principality. It wasn't known as Ukraine at the time, but it was its own kingdom. Now, the king's name was Daniel, or as they call him, Danilo the Great. Now, the capital of Halicia was moved to Lvov or Lviv. So that region, which is considered again today Western Ukraine, had its own principality, its own kingdom. A few hundred years later, the Austro-Hungarian Empire took over, and for the next few hundred years, they controlled that territory. They laid claim to that land, yet they still had Slavic people in charge in that region. The people in that region spoke Old Slavonic. The people in what we know today as Russia and Novgorod spoke another form of Old Slavonic that sounded different. There are writings that talk about how there's already differences at that time in the way they sound in the languages. Eventually, the Polish people took over that region, and that became Poland, or what they called Lesser Poland, which was the Krakow region, also Lvov, all the way to Novolinsk and those regions. The Kingdom of Rus and the Duchy of Muscovy, which were two different kingdoms, essentially they came from the same people, but they were two different principalities. They had different laws, they had different dialects, but they were all still considered the same people. Those regions were vast lands. Just like Russia is huge today and so is Ukraine, at that time they didn't have enough people to inhabit those lands, so they gave those lands to people that were freed. Those freed people were called Kazakhs. And the Kazakhs were the ones that were in charge pretty much east of the Dnieper River, which runs through Kiev, and they ruled that whole region. These people were the ones that were in charge. They fought against the Ottoman Empire. There's even a famous painting where they write a letter to the Ottoman Sultan and they disrespect him with a funny letter. Up until the 1800s, we don't really see that much division between these two groups of people. We do see, again, regional differences, but we don't see that many differences in who they are. Right around the 1800s is when the people in the Ukrainian region began to really see an identity in themselves. Also, the people of Russia started kind of getting really annoyed with the kings. There was a major moment in Russian/Ukrainian history where the Decembrists were a movement of people that went against the king, and they wanted to take over and create democracy in those lands. When that started happening, famous poets, writers, people like Dostoevsky, they started imagining a Russia outside of having kings and queens and having a democratic land where people actually had a voice and had a say. One such person was Taras Shevchenko. Taras Shevchenko was a very famous Ukrainian poet who lived in St. Petersburg at the time. And he wrote a poem about the king and his wife, and he kind of made fun of how she acted. And his poem was kind of the cry of the people. And he talked about a place that did not have rulers like the Tsars that ruled over Russia. In the mid-1800s, when people like Taras Shevchenko and Dostoevsky and other novelists and poets were writing against the monarchy in Russia, is when we really started to see a sense of pride in the region that we know as Ukraine today. This is where we get to talk about the word Ukraine. There's two arguments as to what Ukraine means. Ukraine in Russian is the Krai, or the edge lands. There are some people that theorize that in Old Slavonic, like the word Kraina, which in Ukrainian means country, that the Ukrainians were pretty much their own country. That's kind of how they identify themselves. We don't necessarily know exactly where this came from, but the popular understanding is that Ukraine is considered the edgeland, or the Krai. In the 1900s, after the revolution, is when we saw a huge nationalist movement in Ukraine. The people of Ukraine were tired of being ruled by the Tsars, and now all of a sudden the Bolsheviks and the Marxists and the communists came over, and they started dictating how they should live their lives. At the time, the language that was spoken by the Ukrainian people, Old Slavonic, which at that time was known as Maloruski or smaller Russian, was banned, and only Russian was allowed. And so the people that lived in those regions got a little bit frustrated because they were not able to speak the language that their forefathers spoke, and they had to speak another dialect of Slavic, which was known as Russian at the time. We saw huge uprisings and nationalist movements in Western Ukraine, where the Ukrainian people at that time said, we do not want communism here. But the communists took over with brute force, and they suppressed the people that lived in all other satellite nations. Communism is where you really start to see the difference between Russians and Ukrainians. Again, historically speaking, they were all the same people, but right around the time of communism, you really saw a difference between the people that came from Moscow and the people that were outside in the other countries and other lands that wanted to live freely, but they were dictated by Moscow as to how they should live. In 1933, we saw one of the greatest tragedies in Ukraine, and it was all caused by Stalin. Now, Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, which seated its parliament in Moscow. So Moscow was seen as the house of Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin ordered all the food to be rationed and thrown away from Ukraine only so that they could suppress any uprisings that were going to go against him. And in 1933, nearly 10 million Ukrainians died because of starvation. My grandma happened to live in Ukraine at the time, and she said that her neighbors were eating their dogs, people were eating squirrels, people at that time were getting leather shoes, leather clothes, boiling them and eating that soup. My grandfather, who was also alive in that area at the time, says that for about a week, all he had to eat was grass in a cloth, and he just had to suck on it like a lollipop. And that was the only food he had for about a week at a time. So around the Holodomor, which was a very dark time in Ukraine, people began to resent Moscow. Shortly afterwards, we started seeing the Purges of Stalin. My grandparents at the time lived in the city of Berdychi, which was formerly part of Poland. They were all assassinated by the KGB or the NKVD at the time because they were considered enemies of the communist state. My grandparents were wealthy people. They took all of their silver, all of their belongings, and a lot of their land, and they redistributed everything to the Russian people. Fast forward to 1989 to 1991, we see that the Soviet Union falls apart, and Ukraine now has a chance to finally become its own nation. The people in that region, just like all the other satellite states, have been fed up with being ruled by Moscow for the past 70 years, so they declared their own independence and established their own government. During the 70 years that the communists ruled those regions, everybody was intertwined and everybody would move and relocate. There wasn't really necessarily a state of belonging to a certain area. Everybody just kind of moved around. But when 1991 happened and every single country now was on its own, the people in Ukraine didn't really know necessarily what to do by themselves. And a lot of the people left in the country were still part of the old regime of the Soviet Union. So now we see in the 90s that the people of Ukraine are finally able to create their own laws, establish their own ideals, and do what they want to do. Yet you still have the people that were from the old former Soviet Union telling them what they can and can't do. So the first 20 years of Ukraine's independence, up until about 2010, have been dominated largely by people that were still part of the old Soviet Union, and they told them exactly what needed to be done. So right now we see the sense of Ukrainian pride almost, where the people of Ukraine don't want to be ruled by Russia, and they feel like Russia's been a bully for so long now that they finally want to do their own thing. So when you come up to a person that's Ukrainian and you say, hey, are you Russian? They almost get offended by you because it kind of strikes a nerve with them because they don't want to be associated with them even though they're the same kind of people. Russian people, on the other hand, are also the same thing. They suffered because of communism. They suffered because of Moscow also, because of what the Bolsheviks did. And the Russian people that live in other regions of Russia outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg also don't identify themselves with communists. They don't identify themselves with the policies of Stalin and so on. And so when you come up to them, they don't necessarily see anything wrong with the Russian people, and they don't see why they're hated by a lot of Ukrainians. They're not really hated by Ukrainians. Ukrainians just kind of associate anybody from that area to be associated to Moscow. So overall, this is kind of the history as to why the people of Ukraine don't like to be called Russian. So overall, this is kind of why Ukrainians don't like to be called Russian. This didn't really talk about the Russian aspect of this. This talked more about the Ukrainian side of this. Now, I don't want to offend anybody. I think both Russian culture and Ukrainian culture is beautiful. I think Ukrainian people and Russian people are amazing people. I have friends from both aisles. I don't want to state any political preferences as to whether I'm anti-Putin or pro-Putin. I also don't want to say if I'm pro-Maidan or anti-Maidan. This is strictly trying to be as objective as possible while talking about a little bit of the history and the differences. Thank you guys for watching. If you watched this far, honestly, you're probably my best friend. Thank you guys. See you guys next week.